Welcome to our Ethical Investing webinar with panelists from BetaShares and Perpetual. I'm Brendan, Country Manager for Sharesies in Australia, and today I'm joined by Cameron Gleeson, a Senior Investment Strategist from BetaShares, and Karen Trau, a Senior Product Manager from Perpetual. Thanks both for joining us today. Can't wait to pick your brains on everything ethical investing.
Thanks, Brendan. Great to be here.
We'll have the hard questions for you, so we'll see if you're still happy to be here at the end. Cool. So before we get started, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the land on which we come to you from today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. I will also extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. So our purpose at Sharesies is to create financial empowerment for everyone. One way we do this is through the Sharesies platform, which is focused on long-term wealth development. There are over 500,000 people using our platform across Australia and New Zealand, with over $2 billion funds under management. Our vision is to give someone with $5 and someone with $5 million the same investment opportunities. And we offer access to the Australian, New Zealand, and US share markets with no minimum investment amount, meaning you can buy part of a share with as little or as much as you want. We're also a proud member of the B Corp community, and we believe that businesses like us can be a force for good. So today, we'll break down what ethical investing is, why people invest ethically, look into greenwashing and how to avoid it, and the future of thematic ETFs like those with an ESG focus. And we'll leave time at the end for Q&A. So to put your questions in, you submit them through the Ask a Question button on the bottom of the screen. Don't leave questions in the chat, as we might miss them. And remember, the only silly question is the one you don't ask, so don't be shy. Before we start, we want to remind you that investing involves risk. You aren't guaranteed to make money, and you might lose money that you started with. Any information that we provide today is general only and current at the time we provide it. If you're looking for help with your investment choices, we recommend talking to a licensed financial advice provider. We won't be providing any personal advice today or recommending any particular investment choice or financial product. But if we mention specific ETFs, they're just examples and not recommendations. So a bit of interactivity. Today, some of you might be investors already, and for others, today might be the first time that you think about investing, and that's totally okay. So to break the ice and test the chat function, let's start with a question. Chuck your answers in the chat. What does ethical investing mean to you? You must all be typing very long answers. So Roberta, investing in ethical companies. Investing for a better future and hopefully slowing climate change. Organisations that have a positive impact on the community. Socially responsible. Fair trade businesses. So as you can see, ethical investing can mean different things to different people. When investing, for some the goal might be purely financial returns, regardless of what the investment does. For others, you want your money going to investments that have a responsibility beyond just making a profit. One way to do this is to look for investments with environmental, social, and/or governance focuses, often shortened to ESG. Those sort of companies take particular care in these areas to make sure they're not doing more harm than good. You can find funds that screen by these measures. So some seek out good investments while others just avoid the bad ones. And there's no standard set of rules for what makes a company good or bad in terms of ESG. So it's worth researching funds that you might be interested in. And then the funds that you find which are closer to your own set of values, the better. This is a really interesting graph, and Cameron and Karen, I'll get you to talk about it in a minute. But to set the scene of ethical investing, this graph shows the Google searches for the term ESG over the years. And we can see a massive rise over the last few years. We're also seeing the popularity of ESG-themed ETFs on our platform rise as well, For example, over 20% of the funds under management, which Sharesies has into exchange-traded funds, is invested in ESG funds. Our customers also love ETFs which focus on themes with a bit of an ESG lean to them, like batteries, solar, electric vehicles, and hydrogen technology. So why do you think this is, Karen? Let's start with you.
Yeah, thanks, Brendan. And some very interesting comments going in the chat as well. I think people are being more conscious of their environmental and social impact. And I think they want to invest in a way that aligns with their preferences. And I think a lot of the world events that have happened in recent years have kind of accelerated this even further. So if you think back to the Australian bushfires in 2019, the floods, the COVID pandemic, the Me Too movement, the Russia-Ukraine war, I think all of these have put a limelight on people demanding to invest in line with their values. And I think it's also forcing companies to be a bit more sustainable or have more sustainable outcomes. And I'm sure Cameron can talk to this point as well, but we're seeing, transitions to low carbon and, diversity and inclusion being talked about more in the workplace. And I think those are also throwing up investing opportunities. And I would say probably lastly, the most important point is I think people are realizing, or they're busting that myth that investing ethically doesn't have to compromise financial returns.
That's a great point, because actually companies which are focused on ESG, by their very nature, they're more medium and long-term focused rather than short-term, because the problems which ESG companies are trying to solve are big and take a while to solve. It's great, Karen. Cameron, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly true. I mean, we can look at some of the data on terms of long-term returns, and we see that ethically oriented funds often outperform their non-ethically oriented funds. I mean, I think from our perspective, one thing that we've seen with world events, so right now we've got COP27 going on in Egypt, which is a very important global gathering, defining a lot of the way that we're going to measure carbon in particular, and looking at how we can transition global economies and seeking global consensus. That's a really important global event. But what we see on the ground here in terms of Australian investors is that Australian investors tend to move towards ethical funds when they see an impact in their local setting. Karen mentioned the bushfires in the summer of 2019 to 2020. That fueled a lot of interest in our ethical funds. Similarly, we've seen, as a result of people talking about the floods that we've seen over the last year and a half here in Australia, that direct impact as individuals is focusing people's attention. That's actually, in some ways, unfortunately, what's leading to people to take steps down the path of investing ethically. So we've got a range of ethical funds. Our largest fund is BetaShares Global Sustainability Leaders ETF. Its ticker code is ETHI. That's a very well supported fund in the Australian market, and I believe so on Sharesies. It's a really, really good core fund. But what we've also seen in the product space is that that's a solution for someone who wants to really, I guess, look at a wide range of ESG issues. What if I'm just interested in environmental concerns like climate change? And that's where we've seen a growth of sustainability themed funds out there. One of our funds in that space is Earth, for example. Or just this week, we launched a fund called XMET, which is Energy Transition Metals ETF. So about providing those materials required for decarbonisation. So it's really, I think that localized impact together with a wider range of choices, which has enabled people to really express their views through their investment portfolios.
And you touched on thematic ETFs and ones which go for particular sectors, and we'll touch on that a bit later, because it's really interesting how the product has evolved in the ETF world, and particularly with ESG ETFs. So what would you say to investors who are starting right at the beginning of their ethical investing journey? How do you work out an investment is ethical or not? And how might you position that in an overall kind of broader portfolio? Cameron, let's kick off with you.
Yeah, look, it's a great question. There's a lot of jargon, a lot of lingo around this space. Probably a really good place to start, I'd recommend, is the Responsible Investments Association of Australasia. You can find their website. It's responsibleinvesting.org. And they've got a tab there called Learn. And just click on that tab and just start digesting they talk about what it means, really, you know, what responsible investing means. And that's a broader umbrella term that encompasses more than just what we might call ethical investing. There really is a spectrum of approaches used in this space. One thing we see with a lot of ethically minded investors is they ask a lot of questions of the product provider. And you should do the same. Do your homework, jump on their websites, get an understanding as to how they actually invest your money. That's critical. And if that information is not available, call them up and ask them. You know, look, if I had a company that either sells or produces, you know, alcohol products, and if that's an important issue to you, you know, how will you as a fund manager treat that company within your portfolio? Ask those questions, do your homework. And as I mentioned, that Responsible Investments Association of Australasia is a really, really good sort of independent website. In terms of portfolio construction, what I would say is, and Karen, obviously talk to your fund, but we sort of see a role of different types of funds performing different roles in a ethically oriented portfolio. Typically, people will use a core diversified fund. I mentioned ETI before, which is designed to be a global equity exposure, which is ethically screened. And then some of those more thematic exposures, we sort of generally see them used in a satellite approach. Now, obviously, take your personal circumstances into account here, but rather than having overly large exposures to those satellites, we think it's important to get the core right first and use those satellite positions around the edge.
That's great. Karen, over to you.
Yeah, so I think I completely agree with what Cameron's saying, and definitely, you know, recommend everyone do their research. Cameron did touch on kind of that broad spectrum of ESG investing. And so I think that's really important, because I've seen a lot of the comments when you first asked, what does ethical investing mean? Some people said it's excluding companies that, you know, are supporting coal or tobacco. And then some are saying it's companies that are doing good. And so I think it's really important for investors to kind of be aware of that broad spectrum. And it goes from ESG integration, some funds do negative screening, and then some funds do what you call impact investing. And so, and I'm sure we'll touch on, you know, greenwashing, and this might come into it as well, but I think you need to be really mindful about exactly what you want to achieve when it comes to ethical investing. So on one side, the ESG integration is just companies that are, ETF or other fund managers, they're considering what ESG risks are present in a company and seeing if that impacts the valuation or a company's performance before they invest into it. And then you have negative screening, which is when you exclude certain companies that are engaged in, say, alcohol, gambling, tobacco, nuclear, armaments, animal cruelty, etc. And then that goes into impact investing. And impact investing is where you seek to deliver some sort of social or positive impact. And that could come at sacrificing financial returns potentially, because you're having a different objective. So really important to kind of understand exactly what that fund does, what its objective is. Look under the bonnet, as I say, look at how a fund manager actually, how they decide how a stock gets into their portfolio. So if I use Perpetual's ESG active ETF as an example, the ticker code's GIVE, G-I-V-E, we have a two-step process. So we will firstly exclude companies that derive 5% or more of its revenue from alcohol, gambling, tobacco, nuclear engineering, genetic engineering, pornography, or animal cruelty. And then we have another step which looks at how companies are approaching those ESG issues. So we look at what is their approach to or commitment towards renewable energy. We'll look at their labour standards, their corporate ethics, and then we decide if they go into the portfolio. So there's lots of information on most fund managers' websites, so definitely have a look and do your research.
Yeah, super important. Like people who are interested in ESG and ethical investments really care about where they put their money, and because money can do really good. And I think from both of you, there's that, you know, the industry is full of jargon, but in this area, there's great resources online which talk about the investing underlying, what's in, what's out, and the way that you approach those things. And Cameron's call out to, you know, if that doesn't answer everything, send an email, get on the phone. There's lots of people really who do this day to day who really want to talk about it. So So don't be shy. And we mentioned greenwashing, and it's been in the media a lot lately, including ASIC kind of looking at it. Lots of questions already online about kind of what is greenwashing. So for people who haven't heard of it, it would be great to hear your ideas on what greenwashing is, and then a way to avoid greenwashing. So Karen, let's start with you.
Yeah, sure. I would say in its most simplistic term, I would say greenwashing is where expectations don't match reality. So greenwashing is where a product is misrepresented as being environmentally friendly, sustainable. You might hear the term like it's a green product, but that might not necessarily match what the company's doing in practice. So if I use an example, like a fund that's called the No Gambling Fund, your expectation would be that it doesn't invest in any companies that engage in gambling activities or derive any of its revenue from gambling. But the reality might be that for a company to be included in that fund, the fund manager might say, as long as it doesn't have more than 30% of its revenue derived from gambling. So that's like a clear misalignment between what the investor expects and what the fund is actually doing in reality. And we've seen some examples of greenwashing where I think ASIC have called out some companies that are saying that they are achieving net zero, but they don't have any evidence to actually support that claim. In terms of strategies to avoid it, I think it just goes back to our point earlier about really needing to do your research. I always say that ethical investing, there's no black and white. It can be quite subjective, and it really depends on what your preferences and your values are. So you need to look at what information the fund manager has. Certainly for the ETFs out there, they disclose the full portfolio holdings. So you can see exactly what fund, every single company that the fund is invested in, and that's updated either daily or quarterly. And so you can definitely have a look at to see exactly which companies are in that fund.
Cool. Thanks, Karen. Cameron.
Yeah, look, I think that's a really sort of good description. Just to talk about another example of a fund, had sustainability in the name of the fund. A lot of people would make assumptions about what that fund's like. And to dive back into what Karen was talking about, different ways that portfolios are constructed, a lot of funds will use what's called ESG integration. It's part of their decision process as to whether or not they might include a company, but without definitive rules as to whether a company perhaps breaching particular standards in an area of ESG, without those exact rules determining whether that company is included or excluded, you can end up with quite murky outcomes in terms of the end portfolio. So it's really, is the product doing what it says on the tin? And that's what ASIC is chasing and they're pursuing from product issuers in Australia. I think that the point that Karen makes about not all values, really understanding what values are important to you is critical. A really interesting company in this space is Tesla. Now, Tesla, from a sustainability angle, is unquestionably, a game changer for the automotive industry and a force for good within just that sustainability lens. But you as an individual, that might be your primary driver of interest in this space. However, if you are interested in other areas, whether that be the treatment of their labor force, supply chain issues and the like, Tesla has a particularly bad record in some of these spaces, whether it be labor forces, weaker labor forces sourcing parts, or some of the issues they've had in their own Fremont factory in California. So, I mean, from your perspective, it's really important to define what's my key list of criteria when looking at a company. So for one person, someone might actually say that Tesla is in some ways greenwashed because of the way that it positions itself as a sustainability leader. For someone else, that might be the primary issue that they're concerned about. But it is something that we see a lot in companies. HSBC just got fined the other day for a series of ads where they've promoted the amount of billions of dollars they're looking to supply to renewable energy projects. And they've created a perception that they're a green bank. What they haven't done is told their customers about the billions of dollars over the last 10 years that they've financed fossil fuel projects with. So it's about a holistic view of what a fund or what a company is doing, not just looking at the good stuff, but also looking at the bad stuff too, to understand whether this company is sort of true to label the whole way through.
And kind of building on the themes from all the questions, I think, and back to the beginning, like people should really, like when you enter an investment, it's good to kind of have an investing thesis on why you've invested. I think particularly with ethical investing, it's good to do some thinking about what does ethics mean to you? What are the things you really care about? What are the ones that may not matter to you as much? And then do the research and make sure that you are investing where it is. Tesla, like great example of, because the governance part of ESG can be quite interesting. Now, thematic ETFs. What's your view on the future of thematic ETFs? Not just ones relating to ESG, but kind of in general. So Cameron, we'll kick it off with you.
Yes. So probably the first thing to comment to make on this is that I think it's somewhat of a misconception that ethical ETFs or ethical funds are necessarily thematic in nature. We talked before about ETHI, which is our globally diversified ethical ETF. Karen mentioned GIVE, which is an Australian diversified core exposure. I consider them sort of core building blocks for your portfolio. Thematic ETFs tend to be more focused on a particular theme. So there are certainly thematic ETFs within this sustainability space in particular. I mentioned a few of them before, like Earth, or for example, Drive, which is our ETF, which gives exposure to electric vehicles and the supply chain for electric vehicles. But more broadly, what we've seen has been an interest, dedicated interest in thematic ETFs in that sustainability space. So our first fund in that market was Earth, which was a very diversified exposure to 100 companies whose products and services allow their customers to reduce their carbon emissions. Now we've seen that wider range of choice. So I mentioned XMET before. Looking at all areas of the supply chain for that energy transition, that's become a really powerful structural driver of change in the economy, and it will play out over decades. And people are looking to leverage into this, not just because they're trying to align their investments with their values, but also because they can see the potential for outperformance through investing in these themes. So I think we'll see continued growth in that space.
Great. Karen?
Yeah, I think the themes that Cameron touched on are very interesting. And I was definitely going to say, I think ESG investing will definitely be more prominent. And I think we see those issues evolve every day. Cybersecurity is very topical at the moment. Companies achieving net zero has been talked a lot about in the media as well. Companies need to have higher standards for corporate governance. I think there'll be a greater emphasis on companies needing to achieve sustainable outcomes, not just considering what those ESG risks are. And I think, we'll start to see companies make a lot more progress towards building a sustainable world. So we've touched on net zero, renewable energy, creating more diverse and inclusive workplaces. And I think those will bring about the opportunities that Cameron has mentioned. And I think the other important thing is I think there'll be a greater demand for transparency. And I think there'll be a lot more data and information over the coming years. And that will allow investors to make more informed investment decisions to really understand, does that align with their values? Is this what I'm getting at? Am I avoiding greenwashing, etc.? So I think it will be a very interesting space for sure.
Yeah, just to jump in, Karen, I mean, that's a key point. There's been a number of different, and this is sort of the boring stuff in the ESG landscape, but a number of different frameworks for measuring sustainability that have existed over the years. And that's meant that different companies can, report in a sort of fuzzy way. But over time, there's been a level of agreement that those frameworks need to be standardized globally. So comparability of companies, is far more transparent. So in better reporting from companies, in standardized reporting from companies, we can really measure and compare much better. So the product that you're getting, the investment product you're getting, will be a better product if the input data is better. So that's while kind of boring and in the background, a really important change in the space.
Yeah, and as government policy changes and more funds go into creating a transition to cleaner energy and whatnot, and with ASIC being a regulator who's who's very active in this area and has some great information on their websites and Money Smart sites, that is becoming a more level playing field. So it's great to hear your thoughts on that. Right, so while you're having a think about the juicy questions for us, make sure you pop them in the Ask a Question box. I thought we'd give you a bit of a demo on how easy it is to buy ETFs through Sharesies. So here's Adrian taking us through a quick demo. Pop those questions in the Ask a Question box.
Feel like you're ready to get started or interested in finding another investment for your portfolio? Let's have a look at some example investment options that promote having a positive ESG focus and how you can find them on the Sharesies platform. We often hear from our investors that their favorite thing about the Sharesies platform is how easy it is to use. You can sign up in minutes. If I want to pick a new investment option, I click the Invest tab. From here, I can filter for different options by things like what category it's listed in, or what exchange it's on, or whether it's a company or an exchange-traded fund. If I also have a specific investment in mind, I can search for it in the search bar. And when I click into it, I can see more about how it's been performing, things like the history of its share price. If I'm not sure if I'm ready to invest, I can start and add it to my watch list to keep an eye on it. Or if I am ready to invest, I can go ahead and click into it and click the Buy button. From here, I have two options. I can place a market order or a limit order. There's no minimum to invest on the Sharesies platform, so I can invest the amount that I choose. Another common way that people invest on the Sharesies platform is a feature called Auto Invest. Here, I've got a few different options. I can do a pre-made order with global order and responsible order. These have pre-selected investment options. Or I can set a DIY order up to invest in what I choose. This works just like the Invest tab, so I can search and filter for investments that are right for me, and I can add them into my portfolio. Once I've selected everything, I input the percentage that goes into each one from the money I'm regularly investing. Then I input the overall amount I want to invest regularly. See, I might marry this up with my and a date for this to start. The only thing I need to do to make sure this works is have money in my wallet. And my wallet is where the money lives in my account that's ready to invest. I can top this up with a bank transfer, and I can also top this up with a credit card. Finally, in the account section, this is where my personal details live, and other things like two-factor authentication, which I can set up to keep my account secure. I can also buy a Sharesies gift, so this is giving the gift of investing to someone in my life. That's it from us for now.
Thanks, Adrian. So today we've just done a quick blast through what ethical investing is, why people invest ethically, and a few ways to get you started. If you are ready to get started, we've got a promo code for you. So when you sign up, use the code GROW, and we'll give you $10 in your wallet ready to invest. Right, now over to the juicy part. We've got lots of time for questions. So let's get those questions flowing. So just in the Ask a Question box, just so we can keep track. So let's go with the first one. How can I, as an investor, weigh up investing ethically versus investing in things like blue chips with more of a proven track record or history? Karen, would you like, Karen or Cameron, who wants to go first?
I'm happy to start. Thanks for that question. And I think it's very interesting that you think that there might actually be a difference. Whereas, we spoke about, how to access all the information about a fund. And in fact, if you look at our ethical or ESG active ETF, there's actually a lot of blue chip companies in there. A lot of the insurance, the banks, and Telstra, for example, which are blue chip companies that pass our ethical filters. So I would definitely say I don't think it's one or the other necessarily. I think you just need to dig a bit deeper into exactly what that fund does, what their holdings are, and you might find that the performance is very similar to what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's not just kind of new tech startups or anything who are doing ESG type activity. It can be traditional companies who have been in that space for a while. On the kind of proven track record and history, how many No, like there are years worth of data on some of the ETFs which are in that, which can be looked at for performance and stuff as well. So they're not just new ETFs, or the companies which are part of them have been going for a long time. So great to point out. Cameron, got anything to add?
Yeah. Look, I mean, for example, ETHI, our global sustainability leaders ETF's been around for, I think it might be 6 and a bit years now. So look at performance, look at the list of stocks that are in the portfolio, and actually look at the sector profile. That's often a very big determinant of your performance in different markets. You'll often find that an ethically minded portfolio will be very balanced if it's designed to be that core holding. We do see, I did mention that, but the sustainability themed ETFs, which we suggest are often used as a satellite exposure, those ones can be a bit more skewed and a bit more tilted to a particular area. But if you're looking at that broad core portfolio holding, it should be designed to be diversified and provide a really robust performance in all markets.
Yeah, and a good point on ETFs as well. So exchange traded funds. Remember, it's a basket of securities. So past performance isn't reflective of future performance. So just so everyone remembers that. Also, the markets have been pretty choppy since the beginning of the year. So we're in a bit of a down cycle. Everyone would kind of agree with that. But ETFs again are like a basket of fruit or anything that diversifies a risk. So these ETFs, which are even focused on a sector or a theme that might be quite specific, there's still a lot of different companies in there. So remember, if one goes up or down, it's the average of the portfolio where your money is. So it's kind of a nice way to diversify. And you've got very smart people like Karen and Cameron behind those. So a question on transparency.
Sorry, Brendan. I was just going to make one other point. Just going back to the blue chips. If I was just thinking if they were asking that question because they wanted to receive dividends, just to also know that ETFs as well do pay distributions. So GIVE, for example, does half yearly. BetaShares would be similar, I think, Cameron. So you can definitely earn, a similar income stream as well. If you're seeking to receive dividends from the blue chip companies, you can definitely get a similar profile with the ETFs as well.
Great point. ETFs, you get access to capital growth as well as income dividends as well. So just like other tradable instruments. So transparency, how do you decipher transparency? What are the things to look at?
Yeah, also, I mean, I'll shoot with this one if that's okay, Karen. So I mean, the first thing is, can you see what's in the portfolio? And that's really one of the really good things about exchange traded funds, is that there will be, a level of transparency where there's a requirement to report that portfolio, whether it be daily or quarterly. So you can see all of the stocks that exist in that portfolio. And that's one area where we find a lot of ethically minded investors will actually go through the portfolio and look and say, well, why have you got, for example, Telstra in your portfolio? Why have you got this in that portfolio? That's really what transparency is about. But then also transparency around the rules as to how that portfolio is put together. So the investment process for our ethical funds, they have a defined set of rules which are incorporated within an index methodology. Now, the work that's done to actually screen companies for all those rules takes place through a responsible investment committee. But the fact that you can see what they're looking to screen in and out, how they're looking to positively tilt to certain companies, that's what we talk about with transparency, is seeing the full portfolio and understanding how that portfolio was built in the first place.
And then, so you kind of put a bit of faith in the ETF issuer that there's a process in there, you can see the process. It would be unlikely that a company that was opaque in its dealings or was trying to hide something through greenwashing would get through those different layers. So it's like, no, have a look at the websites of the issuers, work out what process they go through, have a look at the companies underneath, and if there's some there that feel a bit dodgy, then that's something to think about and do some extra research on. Karen?
I don't have much more to add. I think Cameron's pretty much covered everything.
Cool. Well, this can be a question for you, Karen. So I've got a question here. We're interested in knowing what common things to look out for with ESG companies that may not be great on the ESG lens, and how to find those when you're researching about a company's what they're interested in social responsibility, sustainability, etc. What are the kind of, might be the tips and tricks of things that to watch out for?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And certainly Perpetual as an active manager likes to have a lot of meetings with the companies and, discuss what ESG risks and issues they have. And a lot of the times if we see concerns, we'll, kind of express those and kind of lobby for change. I would say a lot of the things that we look out for would be around climate disclosures. So if they have any commitments towards them, how they're tracking towards achieving them, particularly in this current environment where, capital expenses are getting higher with the interest rate environment and inflation. We look at board remuneration is also a big one. So we want to make sure that they're using the shareholders' capital sensibly and that all of the interests are aligned. And so a lot of the times we can always vote against a remuneration report at a shareholder meeting, or we might advocate for different board members to be on there, depending on their skill set or who we think is appropriate. We'll also look at employee engagement. So whether they have gender diversity or diversity and inclusion targets, how they're tracking towards those. We want to look at the culture of a business, what benefits they're providing, their labour standards. We look at their supply chains. So there's been a lot of talk about modern slavery, and we want to make sure that any vendors that they appoint in that supply chain also have ESG considerations in them. And another one is probably waste reduction. That's become a bit more topical as well. So there's a lot of different areas. And I would say certainly, I think a lot of people will think about environment first and foremost when you say ESG, but I think there's definitely a lot more prominence that's coming towards the social and the governance issues as well.
Yeah, because social and governance used to be ones that were difficult to measure, but you've got some great examples of where that is, engagement, diversity on boards, REM and all that sort of stuff. So that's great. Cameron?
Yeah, so I mean, look, it is a difficult space to, as an individual, to really do your own research from a standing start. If you wanted to start somewhere, you might look at the sustainability report, which is part of the annual report of companies. In terms of some of the work we do, so I mentioned before, we have a responsible investment committee who does all the due diligence on all companies in the universe. They do a lot of work at looking at not just what a company is doing in terms of its activity. Is it an oil and gas producer? But also where a company is actually generating revenue. So as an example, we screen out banks or insurance groups that have significant operations lending or reinsuring fossil fuel projects, because you can't build a coal mine without insurance and without bank financing. So an example of a report that you can get yourself is called Bank Track. It's available online. That's an example of a report where you can see globally that banks that are significant financiers of fossil fuels projects. And that's kind of interesting, right? Because often banks will talk about how they're doing good, but there is also reporting out there that's available for everyone to see as to, well, what's the other side of the coin? Where are they in fact financing an activity that you as an investor might want to avoid? So wealth of resources out there. Start by even just calling up the fund provider if you wanted to know yourself, and they can provide you with some of the reports and some of the information that they look at.
Good point. And you could even call up listed companies, their investor relations team, and have a chat to them about what they may or may not be doing. Because as we know, people power is a really great force for change, not just investing with your values. So a bit of a big question now, bit of a definitional one. What's the difference between ethical, sustainable, and responsible when it comes to investing options? Who'd like to take this one first?
I'm happy to lead off with that one, Karen. It's actually sort of one that we've discussed at BetaShares internally because of this, I guess, confusion in terms of terms. We've decided it's very important to define very clearly what terms mean from our sense, which do somewhat align with the Responsible Investment Association of Australasia. We define our suite in entirety in this space as the ethical and responsible investing product suite, if you like. Responsible investing we see as an umbrella term, and that captures impact investing, which Karen mentioned before, ethical investing, which we see as a combination of positive and negative screens, company engagement, proxy voting, a really holistic approach to ethical investing, and then sustainability themed investing, which is really often focusing on the E within ESG. So yeah, we can think of responsible investing as the umbrella term, ethical as a broad-based approach in this space to having a portfolio which is really going to appeal to someone with a wide range of issues they're interested in, and then you've got those thematically led investments, as well as impact, which Karen mentioned before, which is sometimes preferencing outcomes rather than your own financial returns.
Yeah, I was very much going to say something along the same lines as Cameron. I think sustainability definitely has more connotations towards making an impact and positive change, not just kind of, simply excluding certain companies or activities. And I think responsible investments is more of an umbrella term that encapsulates it all.
Again, lots of resources online for people to get stuck into have a think. And then again, it's deeply personal depending on your values and how you see those things. So again, kind of think about why you want to invest and write it down and test that your investments kind of match that. Cool. So question here, when looking at ETFs, we share these on the platform, give a little bit of a blurb on the fund and an exact breakdown of investment percentages and link through to your website. Some companies simply state that they invest in mid or emerging companies, so really general. How can we ensure that those companies are meeting ethical, practical requirements, or sometimes even what that requirement is?
Do you want to take that one, Karen?
Sorry, Brendan. Yeah, so you were saying a lot of the times they state it as investing in mid to emerging companies. Is that correct?
Yeah, so it might be, not our big companies, which might have great sustainability reports and are subject to a lot of oversight, but some of the smaller companies and this probably goes to a bit of greenwashing. It's like, I'm a new fintech, I'm interested in clean energy, have a small shareholder base, I might not be subject to the same kind of regulatory oversight as the big end of town. What would you do to kind of look at those to make sure that their credentials stack up really?
Yeah, okay, that's a very good question. I'd probably suggest starting by looking at their annual report, and that has a lot of information, financial and non-financial information about what a company is doing in that space. So even though a sustainability report is not mandatory for all companies, a lot of companies will now touch on it, given just how topical it is. So definitely have a look at that. As I mentioned, you can always look out for any targets or commitments they make, how they're achieving those targets, looking at board remuneration and alignment, looking at their employee engagement. I would say that often if you're not finding the information that you're looking for, it could be a red flag as well, or you'd have to dig a little bit deeper and contact the company for that kind of information.
Cameron.
Yeah, I mean, it is a tricky space, isn't it? Because these big, ugly multinational companies can afford to spend a lot more money on policies and procedures, and therefore, can look perhaps better than a smaller company that hasn't had those resources available. Those points that Karen make are all spot on. I mean, just look, if you are interested in board diversity, you can look at the board members. All that information will be available. You can sort of see some of these factors. But just really get an understanding as to what their business is, and ideally even who their client base is. So what other activities are they facilitating? I think that's really annual reports best place to start.
Question from me might be a bit cheeky.
ETFs or funds. Oh, sorry. I was just going to add. I think if you're investing in ETFs or funds, and you want to kind of have more assurance or certainty, we spoke about the RIA certification. And so a lot of the fund managers that have their funds RIA certified, that kind of indicates that it's gone through that Independent Responsible Investments Association of Australasia, and they have a very strict criteria as to what passes through them to be considered an ESG fund. So that can also provide a little bit of comfort as well.
Cool. So my question, without naming names, are there any companies that you kind of looked at from the outside and thought they seemed to be pretty good ESG related, but turned out not to be, and there was something in their supply chain or the way they did business that just didn't sit right, but on the outside they kind of felt right? May not be an answer, but
there are so many companies like that. I mean, one really interesting area in the whole ESG space is the use of ESG ratings, which are sort of akin to credit ratings, but within an ESG lens. And there's very large global providers of these ratings. And those ratings are often used by funds to try and build a portfolio. At BetaShares, we eschew that. We don't believe in the approach used to rate a company using ESG ratings. The way that ratings agencies will create an ESG rating is they'll look at all companies within an industry, and they'll basically provide an A+ score and an F score to companies within that peer group, and that applies to oil and gas. So, for example, Total Energy, the French company, has, I think it's A or A+ score, despite the fact their core business is oil and gas. There are tobacco companies with A+ scores based on these ratings, where they're effectively rated against their peer group. Now, our view is that you can't look at ratings and compare a company to its peers in its industry, because certain activities are essentially abhorrent to particular value sets. So it's a really interesting space, the ESG rating space, and one that we think is sort of I think has become somewhat somewhat smelly.
Good point, Karen.
Any
more stories, any things? Because basically red flags, right? What's a red flag?
Yeah.
You wish you'd known.
Look, I won't mention any specific companies, but I think certainly there's been a lot of press about corporate misconduct in particular that's happened in the last few months. And then I would say probably in the kind of environmental target space as well. So claims of being energy efficient or reaching net zero, I think that has been very vague and hard to quantify by some. And so that might appear on the outset to be doing good, but when you dig a deeper, it becomes, not as you expected. Or I would say a lot of times we uncover things in the supply chain. So again, not kind of disclosed upfront, and it requires a lot more research to dig into.
Points. Cool. We've got 3 questions which were pre-submitted, so still got a chance to ask questions if you want to pop them in the ask a question box. The first one is, can investors in an ethical fund give feedback or vote on what companies they want to keep, add or remove to a fund? So how would you approach holders of the ETFs that you have if they want to kind of lobby you to remove or add funds to the ETFs? Karen, do you want to?
That's a very good question. The short answer is no. So the portfolio manager would have, like a fund manager would have full discretion as to what's in their fund. But I would definitely say if you have concerns about a particular company being held in a fund, then you should call up the fund manager to ask why and the basis for why they've included it in there. Like I said, it is quite grey. There's no black and white in ESG investing. And so you need to really understand what the objective of that fund is, and exactly what extent of ethical, social, or governance filters they're applying there. Certainly, as a fund manager, we can lobby the companies to on concerns that we have. If they have any ESG risks, as I've mentioned, we can vote at the shareholder meeting if we have concerns over a particular resolution. And Perpetual has in many cases voted against a resolution.
And that's to bring up, so the active nature of an exchange traded fund is the fund manager does things to manage that basket other than a tracker ETF, which might just be the ASX 200, which keeps all of that. So the difference between those ETFs, active means that you can do those sorts of things. Cameron, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll talk about this in the current state of play, intermediate term and longer term. So if I think about the two sort of core funds that we offer, which I've mentioned Ethy a few times, but FAIR is our Australian sustainability leader, so Australian equities. These are, what I'd consider, relatively true to label, stringently screened funds, both positive and negative screens. Typically what we find is investors, we don't have too many investors coming to us with an issue with companies in those funds. Often they'll ask questions and are very satisfied with the responses as to why a company's included. But what they might want to do is add another stock. For example, they believe that nuclear energy is really important, so they want to add palladium into their portfolio. In our view, it's sort of easier to use a fund which is very well screened and excludes anything they might consider abhorrent, and then add names back. So if they did believe in nuclear, then that's obviously excluded from our fund into FAIR, but they could add Paladin or Boss Energy or whoever it was if they believed in that particular area. In the intermediate term, I think what we will see is the ability for ETF investors to direct how the ETF manager does vote in proxy voting on various issues. There are some regulatory issues that need to be overcome in that space. And then in the longer term, there's a development which is known as sort of direct indexing. And I'm sure that this is essentially where, rather than buying a packaged product as an ETF, however you invest, whether it be through Sharesies or whatever platform, I'm sure there'll be a way to define your own screens, to define what you want within your portfolio, and for that platform to buy that portfolio in line with those screens. So to give you more customization. We're not there yet, but that is looking like it will be the future of ESG investing, say 10 years from now.
Cool. And then a great question, how is ethical investing impactful? So do you have any great stories or great examples that you can provide?
Yeah, sorry, Karen.
Cameron, you go.
No, go ahead, Cameron. Go ahead.
Yeah, so
many examples.
Yeah. So we've had so with our ethical funds, we've if you like added a couple of screens or issues in terms of what's considered over the years, and I think it was 3 or 4 years ago, we added a requirement for board diversity. At least one female member on the board, and we wrote to all companies that were included in the fund who were then excluded from that point. And that was sort of 4 years ago, and we've since had a couple of those companies reintroduced to for example FAIR, and have had commentary from their investor relations team that it's not that our fund in isolation was the reason why they'd improved their metrics in that particular variable, but it's really, I guess, the groundswell of support. So being one voice in many, seeking to seek change from corporates that makes this change. So if you can be one of those 1,000 voices, then that's a good thing.
Great example. Karen.
Yeah, so we actually produce, Perpetual produces an ESG report every year that details all the activity that we've done, and there's examples of what we've done in terms of company engagement. I would say, the main 2 categories would be disclosures. So we always try to advocate for more disclosures around climate risks, what they're doing in the sustainability sector, and then also discussing the board composition and senior management composition. A case study is probably, speaking to a company about a recent CEO leaving. And we wanted to make sure that there was a good skill set of all of the directors on the board to make sure that the company strategy gets delivered. We also look at how much skin in the game a director might have. So we'll look at if they, personally invest their own money, because that makes sure that, their interests are aligned with the company. So we'll look at that as well. And yeah, diversity targets, and we'll also look at and advocate for as well.
Got the best job in the world, making the world a better place, don't you both? And then the last question is, how do we know if a fund or company is registered or part of an ethical industry body? So we've talked about RIAA. Are there other, and also we've talked about some of the ratings which might not be great. Are there other sorts of external bodies that you think would be good to look at, like B Corps or other ones like that?
Yeah, I mean, B Corps is a good one. It's great that Sharesies is a B Corp member. Unfortunately, it's not a long list of companies. If you want to build a diversified portfolio of listed stocks in terms of B Corp accredited companies in Australia, and it's great that Sharesies is one. Just trying to think in terms of other accreditations. Look, one thing that we look for, and whether or not as an investor you have this availability, but you can certainly ask a fund manager, is looking at measures of carbon emissions. Often that is the critical issue. And so if you are investing in an ETF, you should be able to ask them about carbon emissions of various companies in the index, why they're included, what their emissions levels are. So that's a measure which, the requirement around how you report emissions is improving. Companies are improving the way they report emissions. So we think this is that's a really big one.
Yeah, great. Karen?
No, I don't have much more to add. I think the most widely recognised one in Australia is definitely that RIAA symbol. So definitely look out for that.
Yeah. And then as we've talked about, great fund managers who have investment committees who go through processes and all that sort of stuff is important too. So that's awesome. So thank you very much to Karen and Cameron for your time today, answering all the questions. I hope everyone's learned a little bit more about what it means to invest ethically. So thank you all for coming. Thanks for the time, and we'll see you at the next one.
Thank you.